Hey y'all, it's Mr. Hill again. So in this video, we're talking about the original plan, according to the Constitution, for choosing a president. And spoiler, it's changed quite a bit from the way the framers originally intended it to go down. So let's get into it. So presidential selection, the framers' plan. Objectives: explain the framers' original provisions for choosing the president, and understand how the rise of political parties changed the process of choosing a president as set out in the Constitution. So a few terms that you may have heard of before, like electoral college or electoral votes. We'll explain that as we go through. So the Constitution was not some easy peasy document to say, hey, cool, yeah, it's the Constitution, of course. No, there was lots of debate and lots of selling the Constitution to people who otherwise didn't really support it. The framers of the Constitution debated whether to have a president chosen by Congress or by direct popular vote of the people. So if the president had been chosen by Congress, it would be very similar to like a parliamentary system like, say, the United Kingdom has, where the voters go and elect their member of parliament, and then parliament meets, and then parliament picks a prime minister, and that's their leader in the United Kingdom. It would have been kind of like that if we had gone with congressional, selection. But opponents of congressional selection felt it would upset the separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches, which makes a ton of sense. If Congress chose you as the president, are you going to be that willing to stand up to them and rein them in when they're getting, out of line? Or are you going to be beholden to them because they gave you your job? The other option was direct popular vote by the people. Today, this is actually a very popular alternative to what we already have because it makes a ton of sense. And if you're in school, you remember having who's who elections or, class president or officers, whatever. And it's just you vote, you count the votes, whoever's got the most votes wins. Makes a ton of sense. However, opponents of popular election felt that the people would not know enough about the candidates to actually make wise choices. We have two things going for us today as far as our elections. We've got information and communication, tons of it. Back in 1788, the very first presidential election ever, you didn't have a ton of either of those. Now, yeah, you had some communication, but you're talking about writing letters and those letters being delivered by mail carriers riding horses, and who knows how long it's going to take for that letter to get from, Philadelphia to Atlanta. A long time. Same thing with information. There were newspapers and books and pamphlets and things, but we have like the internet today. So it's like instant communication, information. Transportation isn't a problem for us in, modern elections and things like that. And if you go back then, it was a legit concern that you wouldn't have a clue who these jokers were that were on your ballot. Your local people, so you might be more inclined to just write their name in instead of going with whoever is on the ballot. Now, on to the Electoral College, this mysterious enigma piece of American election lore. First of all, let me explain. Electoral College is not like a university. You cannot get a football scholarship to Electoral College. That's not a thing. But it is a group of people, much like a college or university is. So what exactly is it? So the framers agreed on a plan put forth by Alexander Hamilton. You might recall Hamilton from the musical Hamilton. Or for old people like me, maybe like the $10 bill. Regardless, he was the first Secretary of the Treasury we ever had and an all-around pretty smart guy. Here's what he came up with. So you get this Electoral College, which was a body of presidential electors that represent each state. It was a compromise between those first two ideas that we talked about in the previous slide. We don't want to do congressional selection because you don't want the president beholden to Congress. You're not going to do direct popular vote because the people might not have enough information or communication to make wise decisions. So let's combine the two, kind of. Let's meet in the middle have this electoral college, this body of electors that can be informed, but aren't Congress. So they don't have as much skin in the game as perhaps Congress would. Each state would have as many electors as it had senators and representatives. So if your state had 5 representatives, that's 5 electoral votes, plus your 2 senators for a grand total of 7 electoral votes. And that's still the way it is today. You think about in Mississippi, for example, we've got 4 representatives and 2 senators. We have 6 electoral votes. California has 53 representatives and 2 senators. They have 55 electoral votes. So every state gets a minimum of 3 electoral votes. A state's electors would be chosen by popular vote in that state, but state legislatures would decide how presidential electors would be allocated. So that's just a bunch of fancy language for the people would go and vote for their preferred candidate, and that would, in effect, select a group of electors, and then they would go and cast, their electoral votes. Each elector would cast 2 electoral votes, 1 for a different candidate. So you could vote for George Washington and John Adams, but not George Washington and George Washington, or John Adams and John Adams. It had to be 2 separate people. The candidate with the most electoral votes becomes president. Makes sense. Here's where things get weird, at least relative to where we are today. The candidate with the second most votes becomes vice president. That is not how it is today. If that were the way it was today, then you'd have President Donald Trump and Vice President Hillary Clinton. Can you imagine how dysfunctional that White House would be? It would be a complete disaster. So, as far as the vice president being the runner-up in the Electoral College, that works as long as both the president and the vice president are of the same political persuasion, maybe even the same political party. The framers did not anticipate the rise of political parties competing for the presidency, and that's why the system, as originally intended, broke down entirely in the election of 1800. To talk about the election of 1800, you have to back up one cycle to the election of 1796. And for our purposes, we're going to back up even more than that. So 1788, the very first presidential election ever. You have George Washington wins unanimously. He is our first president. The runner-up is John Adams, so he's the vice president. Second presidential election ever in 1792. Washington runs for re-election and wins again unanimously. John Adams is unanimously selected as the VP. But then Washington retires. He's not going to be president anymore. He's not going to run anymore. John Adams, meanwhile, says, I would totally love to be president. So Adams decides to run for president. The problem came in when his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, decided to run as well. So Jefferson actually served with both Washington and Adams in Washington's administration as the first Secretary of State that we ever had. In 1796, John Adams, who was running as a Federalist for the Federalist Party, finished first, and the Democratic Republican candidate, Jefferson, finished second. So Democratic Republican, it's just another political party. It's Jefferson's political party. Eventually, it'll rebrand and become just the Democrats. And then a completely different Republicans will surface much later on. So Adams is president. Jefferson is the vice president. They were cats and dogs. They were Ole Miss and Mississippi State. They were peanut butter and spaghetti. They just didn't work well together. But that's the way it was for the next 4 years until the election of 1800, and you get a rematch. Federalists, Democratic Republicans, Adams versus Jefferson yet again. For the first time, each party nominated 2 candidates, one specifically to run for president and the other specifically to run for runner-up so that they can be vice president. So you have on the Federalist side, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, the guy who kind of came up with the whole system, and Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr for the Democratic Republicans. And each party also nominated electors who, if chosen, swore to vote for their party's presidential and vice presidential nominees. So you've got these electors who aren't going to be swayed. They're going to vote for, if they're Federalist elector, they're going to vote for John Adams. If they are Democrat Republican elector, they're going to vote for Thomas Jefferson. So in this map, the green areas voted for Jefferson, the orange areas voted for Adams. And not that you can tell this, but there is a pretty clear urban-rural divide even at this point in history. The states in green tended to be more rural, more country, and the areas in orange tended to be more urban, more city. So there's your breakdown. Election of 1800. Democratic Republicans taking 53%, Federalists taking 47%. That's of the popular vote. And as far as electoral votes, you've got 73 electoral votes for Thomas Jefferson. But you also have 73 electoral votes for Aaron Burr, and that's a tie. And in case of an electoral college tie, it goes to the House of Representatives. Why did we even wind up with a tie? There was some kind of miscommunication between the Democratic Republican electors. The plan was for all those electors to vote for Jefferson, obviously, and all but one of those electors to vote for Aaron Burr with their other vote. So it was supposed to have been Jefferson 73, Aaron Burr 72, and then there you go. You got a president, you got a vice president, a winner and a runner-up. But since somebody didn't get that memo, you wind up with this tie. Whenever there is a tie in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives gets to choose among the top 3 vote getters. So now you've got Jefferson and Burr and John Adams thrown into the mix when it comes to this House of Representatives tiebreaker. Popular opinion favored Jefferson, who had run as the party's formal presidential candidate, but there was no rule stating that he had to win the tie. So we got to get down to voting. Whenever there is a tie in the Electoral College, each state as a whole gets 1 vote. So it doesn't matter how many representatives that state has, they all have to agree and come to a consensus on how to spend their 1 vote. It took the House 36 separate votes to finally break the tie and elect Jefferson as president and then let Burr be the vice president. So this was a fiasco. If you think back, if you remember far enough back to 2016 or any other presidential election, the 2016 election was nuts. It was something that defied all the expectations and predictions. You had a popular vote winner who didn't actually win the White House. A lot of people would say 2016 was crazy. 1800 was absolutely bananas. I can't imagine what an 1800 election would be like in like 2020 with all like the CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and Twitter and all this kind of stuff. Regardless, 1800 was crazy. It was a circus. It was a fiasco, and it resulted in the 12th Amendment. So 12A was ratified in 1804, which created within the Electoral College 2 separate elections, a presidential election and a vice presidential election. So each elector still has 2 votes, even today in 2020, but they cast 1 vote in a presidential election and their other vote in a separate vice presidential election. And that's it for section 3. So in the next video, we'll talk about how presidents are actually nominated, which, can be confusing depending on what's going on. So check out the next one.